So
Maybe start with, but do the 2 and 2, I think.
I think-
Easier. Yeah.
Okay, we can do that.
So,
Maybe
yeah.
start with the Americans this time. You start with
Okay, well then, welcome to this panel on Muslims and electoral politics, which of course carries on quite nicely from the panel, the really excellent panel that we just heard. This program is being taped and ultimately will be up on our website. So for the benefit of the people who will not have what you have in front of you, the questions for the panels and some information about the panelists, I'll say something extremely briefly. The questions that this panel was hit with are: Muslims continue to be underrepresented in electoral politics in Germany and the U.S. What are the reasons for the absence of Muslim participation in state and federal elections and political office in Germany and the U.S.? Are there differences between the U.S. and Germany and among the local, state, and federal levels in both countries? Does the Muslim community itself see underrepresentation as a problem? If so, what kind of efforts has the Muslim community undertaken to increase political representation? And in keeping with some of the comments that were made in the last panel, I can't restrain myself from telling you that in the United States, at least, the whole question of Muslims in electoral politics seems to be a very contradictory and schizophrenic kind of situation. A recent poll showed that only 64% of Muslim Americans are registered to vote in comparison to 81% of the overall population. But in the year 2008, in the state of Virginia, which we are very close to here, which had not backed a Democrat for president in more than 40 years, Barack Obama won with fewer than 160,000 votes, 70,000 of which came from Muslim Americans. And the leader of an imam, who was also the leader of the Muslim American Society Freedom Foundation in Virginia, told the media, and I'm going to quote from what he said, "We used Friday prayer, religious holidays, gatherings, and conventions to register Muslims. In Virginia, on Election Day, we had 30 taxi drivers who did nothing but take people to the polls all day." So there are things that are going on. Now, let me introduce our panelists. We're going to start with Janan Ghazal-Reid, who is all the way on my left, an associate professor of sociology at Duke University and the director of postdoctoral research at the Duke Global Health Institute. She is also a Carnegie Scholar examining factors that affect Muslim American political integration in both the United States and France. Sitting immediately next to her, Susana dos Santos Herman, who has been a member of the Cologne City Council since 2004. She has advised municipalities in matters of intercultural communication and has acted as a trainer and moderator for integration workshops with the Bertelsmann Foundation, in addition to publishing articles and books on the topic of municipal politics. Abdulkader Sino, who is sitting to my immediate right, is an assistant professor of political science and Middle Eastern studies at Indiana University in Bloomington and a 2009 Carnegie Scholar. Some of you may know that the Carnegie Foundation has been very instrumental in fostering research about Muslims. He is the author of Organizations at War in Afghanistan and Beyond, and is currently writing a book about Muslim representation in Western liberal democracies and another on Islamist parties' participation in elections. And finally, all the way to my right, Dr. Andreas Wurst is a research fellow and visiting professor of comparative political behavior at the Mannheim Center for European Social Research at the University of Mannheim. He is the co-author of various works on immigrant integration, which the names of which I'm not going to tell you because they're in German and I will embarrass myself. And with that, we're going to turn the microphone over to Dr. Reid. We're going to go in order slightly different from that on the your sheet, so stay with me here.
Thank you. First, let me say thank you, Philippa and Lily, for inviting me. I was here 4 years ago talking about Arabs in America, and I was 7 months pregnant with my second daughter, so I'm much happier to be here and not in that state today. But I only tell you that story because I think it gives a little bit of insight into the current climate that we're in. I was here 4 years ago talking about Arabs in American politics. I was an expert on Arab Americans. In the ensuing years, I'm much more of an expert on Muslims because that's what people want to know about. So with that, I'd like to say that I think what I'm going to talk about fits very nicely with the panel before. In just broadest terms, I'm going to talk a little bit about identity politics and what that means for the future of Muslim participation, particularly in the U.S. context. So I think it's useful to think about the participation of Muslims in American politics in two phases, pre-9/11 and post-9/11. Not because of the events of that day per se, but more because of what happened in the ensuing weeks and months after 9/11. So why was 9/11 so important? Well, because like other groups in American politics, Muslims needed something to catalyze them as a group, something to bring them together around their Muslim identity, something to make them want to coalesce to bring about policy changes. So the war on terror globally and the discrimination and racial profiling on the home front served in that capacity to some extent. And I'll get back to what I mean by to some extent in a few minutes. But first, let me back up to pre-9/11 and talk about what do we know about Muslims in American politics pre-9/11. Well, unfortunately, is Kerr gone? Did he leave? Yeah, because he could have probably told us something about Muslims in American politics pre-9/11. Islam might have been able to tell us something, but in general, we didn't know a lot about Muslims in American politics pre-9/11 because we weren't focused on Muslims as Muslims per se. So like other Americans prior to 9/11, what we do know is that their participation in politics was driven by a lot of other things other than their religion. Where did they live? How much money did they make? How well educated were they? These were the things that were most likely to predict how they voted, whether or not they were registered to vote. How old are they? Did they go to college? Were they conservative? In other words, being Muslim wasn't the driving force in their political activism. Let me say that again in a different way. Being Muslim did not innately predispose them to think and act a certain way. Being a Muslim as the most important thing in politics is something that's been sort of imposed on the Muslim population. It's not necessarily an internal force. In other words, I don't go to the polls and always vote, based on my being a Muslim. I vote based on, the taxes. So this sort of Muslim identity prior to 9/11 wasn't really at the forefront. So back to 9/11. 9/11 acted as an external force that created a Muslim American identity that was virtually non-existent, or at least hidden from the mainstream America up until that point. Not only did it create that identity as important, but it also propelled it to the forefront and privileged it above other forms of identity. So it didn't matter if you were a doctor or a mother or a neighbor living in the suburbs of Houston. You were now seen first and foremost as a Muslim. So what did this result in? Well, I'll give you a couple of statistics, but I can also tell you some anecdotally. I was in Houston at the time at Rice University right after 9/11, and I had a grant from the Russell Sage Foundation to study Arab and Muslim identities post 9/11 to see how it was affecting their integration. In the prior panel, we don't use assimilation in America anymore, but integration, and ultimately we're talking about the same thing. So I had this grant, and I had a student who was a pre-med at Rice University as my research assistant on the project, a Muslim young lady. And about 8 or 9 months after 9/11, she decided to wear the hijab. And her family was upset, and so I started talking to her, and I said, "Why are you doing this now at a time when this is at the height of racial discrimination, burning down buildings in Houston?" So she decided to wear the hijab. She said, "I want, before I was just an American, U.S. born, but now." I'm a Muslim, and I want people to know that the same person they liked before 9/11, a good, smart, young lady, is still a good, smart, young lady, and I want to sort of bear that. So in that sense, she felt that being Muslim was now the identity that she identified with most, not just being an American or being a student or going to be a doctor. So, more back to the political aspect. So what that resulted in was sort of this huge, and by huge, I'm going to say this proportionally, in the Muslim context, a huge wave of sort of increased mobilization and political participation. So in 2004, 50% of 100 candidates nationwide were elected to office, the most of any in any election year. And as in the prior panels alluded to, we now have 2 congressmen, Larry Shaw in my current home state of North Carolina, and Keith Ellison at Minnesota. Let me also say, interestingly, because this gets back to what my major point is going to be about identity politics, they're both African American Muslims. So, again, back to sort of the fragmentary nature of the Muslim population, the diversity. So that, I think, sort of speaks to that the Muslim political participation is still fragmentary. And we talked a little bit in the earlier panel about the diversity of Muslim Americans, but I think the diversity is good, but it also keeps the Muslim coalition from unifying. So in terms of how Muslims compare to other groups in American politics, groups usually come together around some issues. And the Muslim population has a hard time with that because you've got African American Muslims, and you can read New York Times series from Andrea Ellett about the African American Muslim mosque in New York not getting along with the South Asian mosque because of differences over cultural differences. But you've got different contingencies, and when it comes to political participation, they're wanting to mobilize based on what's most important to them. And it's usually not that they're a Muslim. So that really inhibits sort of them coming together and working as a group. That's not to say that we're not seeing an increase in Muslims in office, but it's just not necessarily because they're Muslim, which, as in the earlier panel, that's not necessarily a bad thing. But again, I'm trying to answer questions that were posed to the panel about where are the future, why are they underrepresented? Will did the Muslim community see this as a problem? Yes, the Muslim community sees underrepresentation as a problem, but they've got their work cut out for them to mobilize Muslims to vote as a bloc. So, I said immigrant Muslims are torn between focusing on U.S. foreign policy and policy on the home front. All of this has, sort of been said before, and sort of preaching to the choir about this. What I think is interesting and what we need to think about, and increasingly we're seeing this in the U.S. context, what's going to happen when the second and third generation come of age? Because what we know about these youth is they're much more politically conscious and politically aware and much more likely to be politically mobilized. So I think, in terms of the future directions of Muslim American politics, it's going to be interesting to see how these second generation Americans view their Muslim identity in terms of their political activism. Is their Muslim identity going to be sort of a driving, unifying force? And I think that's a question, an empirical question that we don't have the answer to yet. I would hypothesize that this generation, the next generation, will be much more active. They will take a much more active role, and it will be more centered around their Muslim identity than the first generation, their parents, and the second and third generation. Also, in terms of comparing to the German context, and then I'll conclude with this. I don't want to take up more than my share of time. I thought about this during the earlier panel. The one thing that we need to talk about when we're comparing cross-nationally that we don't talk about very much is the geography, the sheer geography of the United States and how that affects political mobilization. The state versus the federal versus the local, and how that compares to other more compact, geographically compact places. Not only does the geography matter in those terms, but also in terms of the transnationalism. Muslims in America are a lot more further removed physically, right? Not necessarily now because of technology from their counterparts, but they're much more physically isolated from their homelands than are, Muslims in Germany or Muslims in even England. You can hop on a plane and be in Beirut in 4 hours. So those are issues also that affect their worldview and how they participate. And, if you're in the U.S. and you're going to stay in the U.S., you may be a little bit more focused on U.S. policy than U.S. foreign policy than you would be if you're much closer to what's going on in the Middle East. Thank you.
Thank you so much.
Great. We're going to have an academic debate about some of the points that we take for granted, and I'm looking forward to this. I will talk today. I'm working on a really elaborate project on the dimensions of Muslim representation, and I'm bringing together a few pieces from different of those published and finished pieces together to share with you today. And the two main questions I will answer is how come you have Muslim underrepresentation in politics today, and also what can a Muslim representative do that's helpful to Muslims. I can't tell you whether Muslims want, scientifically, whether Muslims feel that underrepresentation is really a problem because we don't have a survey about that, and then we'll talk about the effectiveness of Muslim representation. What allows a Muslim in office to do something to help the Muslim minority in the country, and what keeps him from doing that as much as time allows. Now, there are two congressmen in Congress, as you know, since 2009. The other one is actually Andre Carson from Indianapolis. Larry Shaw is in the state legislature, and there are about 8 state legislatures in the United States out of about 8,000 or so state parliamentarians. I know of 3 mayors, and there are a few dozen councilors of Muslim background in the United States. Now, why are they underrepresented? I would like to challenge the common assumptions that internal divisions are a major factor, and that there is reluctance to participate and compete. I have immense respect for Corey Saylor and what CARE does, and how well plugged they are into what they do. However, I mean, they're affected by their very peculiar experiences and exposures as well. Now, if you look at surveys that reflect of Muslim populations, the DAS survey focus on the Detroit area, the Zogby surveys, Pew surveys, we find that an overwhelming majority of Muslim Americans are for participation, are interested in it, and are motivated, especially after 9/11. And we also see in areas where you have Muslim concentration, like in the Detroit area, in the greater Detroit area, you have a considerable number of Muslims who run for office. Janan had done a lot of research on this. I just also finished the study on this. But their election rates are low compared to Arab Americans who are not of Muslim background. And among Muslims who do get elected, those with obvious Muslim names are less likely to get elected unless they come from Hamtramck, where you have a very large, almost a majority Muslim population now today. You have now 3 on the city council there. Another hypothesis is that Muslims don't have a poor understanding of the political process. They're not well integrated, and that's why you don't see them in elected office. Well, I think this is also a weak argument because, as already has been mentioned, there's a high level of socioeconomic accomplishment among American Muslims, definitely among those who were not born elsewhere within the immigrant community. And in general, they have a higher level of socioeconomic accomplishment than the average American. Immigrants, of course, catch up over time. And of course, the African American component is less educated and less accomplished economically than the African American, but it also has been existing, has been in the country for a long time. And African Americans who are not Muslim tend to do quite well when it comes to representation. Now, you also have high levels of representation of Muslims in the professions and in appointed office in areas of high Muslim concentration, like in Michigan. It's incredibly high in the Democratic Party. In Democratic Party institutions in Michigan, especially in areas where there are a lot of Muslims, in county government, but also in the state institutions in Michigan. And I have a whole list of those folks. Now, another argument that was made by Mr. Saylor is that there's poor organization among Muslims. On the national level, he may be right. Muslim organization is fairly thin, even though I think they're doing a fairly good job within the constraints of the resources. But even in places where you have a high concentration of, concentration of Muslims, like in Detroit, there you have a very thick organizational structure. You have many Muslim and Arab organizations in Detroit, in Dearborn, in the surrounding areas, and they're very active. And the DAS survey show that they have the support of many of the Muslim and Arab Americans in the region. And so this by itself does not explain underrepresentation, which does exist in that area in Detroit. Ethnic and sectarian diversity. I mean, this is accepted wisdom in general. I would like to challenge this. It matters on many levels, but not when it comes to electing a Muslim for office. I went through the SEC records to see who sent money to Keith Ellison when he was running for the first time for office. He was to become the first Muslim congressman. And a third of his donors have South Asian and Arab names. He is an African American Muslim. So obviously the ethnic differences did not make a difference, and it galvanized Muslims of different backgrounds to back him just for the pride of having a Muslim in Congress, perhaps to represent their interests. Also, as we know, the Somali immigrant community in Minneapolis was galvanized by his candidacy and participated strongly to his re-election through canvassing and other activities. We also see that in other elections. Under Carlson, the congressman from Indianapolis, I was somewhat I was familiar with his campaign. I also know there was a lot of involvement from immigrant Muslims to support him. He's also African American. Now, the chokehold of Muslim participation is also not on the level of the parties. Now, for local government, the parties don't play a big role in the United States, so it doesn't really matter. In areas of high Muslim concentration, like in the Detroit area, Muslims are highly represented in the Democratic Party. The third ranking official in the Democratic Party is of Muslim and Arab background, and there are many appointed officials of Muslim and Arab background through the auspices of the party. So among Republicans, they're underrepresented, but I don't think that's a major issue. Now, it's not public hostility against Muslims alone that explains their underrepresentation also. If you compare the United States with European countries and Canada, a survey by the Pew Foundation 3 years ago found that the rates of hostility towards Islam is much higher in Europe, particularly in Germany and the Netherlands, where it was highest. Now, the question of the survey was, do you have a positive or negative attitude towards Islam and Muslims? Those who answered high, low opinion or very low opinion of Islam and Muslims totaled 52% in Germany and in the Netherlands, compared to the 20s in the United States. Yet you have much more representation of Muslims, as in having Muslims in parliament in the Netherlands than you do in the United States, proportionally, right? And in absolute numbers. So it's not that by itself that explains underrepresentation. What explains underrepresentation is a combination of three things in the United States. That those 22% that who are hostile towards Muslims, and even more, and then we have also more specific surveys where that found that between a third and 60% of Americans, depending on the survey and the way the question was framed, would not vote for somebody just because they are Muslim, even if they agreed with their ideas. This component, in the context of having first past the post districts, horse races districts, basically where somebody has to be ahead of his next opponent to be elected. This kind of race, as opposed to what we have in Europe, in many European countries, like where you have list parties with lists competing, and the diffusion of the Muslim population in this large United States, the geography. The combination of those three factors explain underrepresentation. Now, think about a district where there are very few Muslims, as most districts are in the United States. You have very few areas of high concentration to make up for that popular hostility. If a Muslim cannot count on a portion of those who would vote for a candidate from his own party on a regular basis, just because he's a Muslim, he's heavily handicapped in that race. And his chances of winning are very slim. And those who would back him know that. Add to that campaigns of hostility towards any Muslim candidate that he may have witnessed in the past and that he wouldn't want to experience himself. And then you have a restriction on the supply of Muslim candidates and the lowering of their chances of winning. So there is a Muslim handicap in elections in those kind of districts. Now, where does this hostility come from? There are many sources, and that's one of the main challenges for Muslims in the United States and in Europe as well. There are many groups who feel that their interests are threatened by Muslims, right or wrong, in most cases wrong. One of them is you have religious groups who feel that Islam is a rival, vital religion and a theological threat to them, including evangelicals and some others. you have pro-Israel groups who assume that Muslim elected officials would be anti-Israel or act against the interests of the state of Israel, and so it's incumbent upon them to fight their election. Now, this is not a statement about Jewish communities in the United States, but about specifically pro-Israel group. In fact, Keith Ellison, to get elected, made sure to build strong ties with the Jewish community in his district in Minneapolis. That's the 5th district in Minneapolis. And when his opponent, who is of a Jewish background, compared him to Hitler during the election, Jewish organizations in his district who already knew him and knew what he stood for came to his defense and asked his opponent, Alan Fine, to apologize for the statements he made. You also have GLBT groups, in some cases, who feel threatened by Islam in general and who feel that the election of Muslims might impede their rights or legislation that would help assist them. This is more of a salient issue in Europe, particularly in the Netherlands, but you have had small instances of that in the United States on the local level, and in Hamtramck, which is a small township in Michigan. This had happened recently. I'll keep that story for another day. You also have some feminist groups who feel or believe that Islam restricts women, and they associate that with the presence of Muslims in the West as well. Just like we heard the question about Sharia or what have you, those are fears. They may very well be irrational. In fact, the question about Sharia, no offense, but because it is irrational, because there's no opening in the law to allow the implementation of other types of law within it in the United States. There are some countries where you have a little bit of that, like in the UK and Canada, but we don't have that in the United States. But this has been an issue, and the way it was solved was very unpleasant for Muslims and others. Now, etc. So the complex web of hostility is very hard to surmount for Muslim candidates, for many Muslim candidates. The role of the media, conservative media as well as religious media, is particularly negative. Not only Fox News, but also Christian television and radio, where you frequently have Islamophobic statements being made. And a study by Nisbet and et al. In my edited volume on Muslims in Western politics makes the point very powerfully, statistically. Now, but a Muslim can still get elected. How can a Muslim get elected in the United States? What are the conditions under which this can happen? Well, if they have another layer of identity, like being an African American, perhaps like being a woman, may help reduce the importance of the Muslim component of identity. Another factor is that if the district has enough Muslims to make up for the handicap, this would help him get elected if they get galvanized. We see that in districts in Canada and the UK, where you have high concentrations of Muslims that help elect the Muslim candidate. You have a similar electoral system, but with smaller districts and high concentration in some districts of Muslims than we have here. Now, if you have a Democratic primary in a heavily Democratic district, and a Muslim wins it, then they're more likely guaranteed to win that district. Now, you have to also understand the demographics of bias and hostility towards Muslims. And once you do, you can tell in which district a Muslim has a chance to get elected like any other American, or an American who is not a Muslim. I know from another study I've done, is that an American evangelical is 5 times more likely not to vote for somebody who is Muslim just because they're Muslim than the average American. A Catholic, 3 times as likely. A conservative, 3 times as likely. So among Republicans, the core constituency of Republicans are much more unlikely to want to vote for somebody because they're Muslim than the constituent groups of voters who vote for Democrats on a habitual basis. So a Muslim is unlikely to ever be elected if he is a Republican. He will be penalized by his own base. He may have a chance if he's a Democrat in a heavily Democratic district where the average voter is not likely to be biased against Muslims. Also in districts where the level of education is higher and that's more youthful, because those characteristics, people are knowledgeable about Islam or are more highly educated, tend to be less biased. etc. In Europe, in several European countries, you have a PR system or PR-like system, like in Germany. Am I running too much over time?
About 3 more minutes.
You got it. Okay. There you have a different dynamics. There you have a different dynamics where you either have a very decent representation of Muslims in the parliament, or you have none at all. And that's my argument why. In those countries where you have party lists competing, parties don't bring Muslims onto their list because there's a risk involved in being the first in doing so. Until one does, most likely a Green Party or maybe a conservative party that wants to show that they're avant-garde, not as hostile to immigrants, and then they make gains electorally, and other parties hurry up to imitate them. And then you have Muslim overrepresentation because of that dynamics. For example, in the Netherlands, in the previous parliament, you had 10 Muslims out of 150, and I use the term Muslim very loosely, meaning people of Muslim background or heritage. 10 out of 150, and they came from 6 different parties. In the one that followed, the chamber that followed, you had 7, and they came from 5 different parties. In Belgium, you also had similar numbers. Out of there were 6, and they came from 3 different parties. Now, however, the type of representative you have is very different. Now, a Muslim who is elected to office, whether on a party list, if he is on a party list, his first duty or her first duty is to serve the interests of her party or the voters of that party. If elected from a district, is to serve his constituents, no matter what their background is. Their job is not to represent Muslims. But they may choose above and beyond that to represent the interests of this minority, which has serious issues and it suffers from serious discrimination, and it has to deal with existential issues. And so some of those representatives do a minimal job of representing that minority just by virtue of being there, and some are activists. Now, what can they accomplish? If they just sit there, people who look different and whose name is different, I found in my research in the UK, in the United States, and elsewhere, that the language in the elected body begins to change by virtue of having them there. Just like when you have the first woman elected to an elected office, to an elected body. It becomes less hostile to Muslims. Statements are made more thoughtfully. The Muslim official also makes it easier for Muslim constituents to approach state institutions. Muslims in the district come to him, ask him, how can I do A, B, or C? And most of the time they don't know, especially if they're immigrants. And he plays that role of initiating them into pursuing their rights and institutionally. They become more comfortable, Muslims become more comfortable with the institution because of that. And by virtue of being there, he or she can challenge unfair decisions that negatively affect Muslims that are made by the parliament, council, or committee more effectively. Many examples are about building schools or building mosques within the borough in the UK, let's say, or city, or within the city borders in the United States, city district in the United States, and often after many rejections, when you have a Muslim in the city council or the borough, their presence makes all the difference by challenging what are obviously unfair decisions. I have plenty of those examples from Australia to Michigan to the UK. If that person is an activist, they can do more. They can use their office, their elected office, as a platform to advocate on behalf of Muslims, because then the media gives them attention. They can also help produce more equitable policy by informally educating other elected officials and members of the executive. In the House of Lords in particular, many of the lords I interviewed did that quite effectively. They didn't have direct impact, but they could educate people around them in the government. And some who are particularly creative or effective representatives can provide badly needed public goods and reduce tensions within their districts in one shot. One of my favorite examples, he's an elderly Pakistani gentleman of Pakistani origin in the UK. He was the first mayor elected, Muslim mayor elected in the UK, and he's been on his city council since the 1970s. In his district, in his borough, his main constituency are Hasidic Jews. And they've been voting him into office since the 1970s. and he's been serving them really well, and he played a major role in reducing tensions between them and the 15% of Muslims in the borough. And he used his position to provide an Islamic center to help Muslim immigrants gain skills, work skills and language skills and computer skills to integrate well, as well as starting the only housing association in the UK. You know, and so that's a process of conflict resolution. Okay, I'm going to stop there. Thank you.
Thank you. Andreas?
Yeah. Yeah, I've already taken notes, so I could easily fill the 10 minutes with responding to what you just said and give some examples that underline the importance of a couple of points that you have actually made. But let me start with, first of all, thanking the AICGS and the Woodrow Wilson Center for inviting me today. I'm a political scientist focusing on immigrant voting and immigrant representation. So I'm taking a quite different view on the topic, and will try to establish links to Muslims as voters and Muslims as representatives wherever possible. And I will also show you, or at least point to a couple of reasons why this is the case, why I'm taking this specific perspective. And coming back, Philippa, to your introduction, there is at least one nice book edited by Thomas Saalfeld, Karen Bird, and me, which will be out very soon with Routledge, which is on the political representation of immigrants and minorities in English. So you can read some of what I will present also in an English publication. So I will talk about political actors of immigrant background in Germany, and will take you on a tour through the core findings of my research and of research of colleagues. And in the end, I will present you some open questions and maybe also possible answers to these open questions. Immigrants as political subjects, I think this is something that was a non-issue back in the 1980s and even in the early 90s in Germany. So we still thought of immigrants being objects of policy instead of being subjects of politics. So this is a completely new area, and I was among those people who have started working on this back in the 90s. The biggest problem then and now is that we have a lack of voting-related data on immigrants and on their descendants. So we have a couple of surveys in Germany, like the Socioeconomic Panel and other nice surveys, which, however, do not tackle political or rather party-oriented issues, which is partly caused by the fact that these surveys are financed by governments, so they cannot take a partisan position, and asking a question of, for instance, on party choice would be problematic in these government-funded studies. So what I had to do back in the 90s was to create my own data. And I did that with the help of some friends like Dieter Roth of the Forschungsgruppe Wahlen in cooperation with Thomas Bellut, back then responsible for the Politbarometer in the German TV channel ZDF. So I was able to include identifying variables in the monthly poll Politbarometer, and were able to pool that data over 12 months, both in 1990 and in 2001, 2002, the 12 months before the Bundestag election of 2002. And I was also able to do a local study in Heidelberg for 1999 on naturalized citizens and their voting behavior. So since no one has really touched this issue seriously after I have dealt with it, I, be repeatedly contacted by journalists on this issue, also by colleagues, whether there are new data and so on. So, and this is a kind of a fate I share with other people doing research in this area, like Sean Tilley. I mean, he's always telling me, since no one else is doing that, I'm doing it again. So, actually, what I try to do is to bring in those indicators of migration background in the European election study, which has been conducted in 27 countries last year, and also in the voter study and then the candidate study of the German National Election Study 2009. And I was able to do this Heidelberg study again 10 years after I had done that for my dissertation last year. Number of cases is still very low. Especially if you want to go into subgroups. So in total, there are sometimes 200, 300 people of immigrant background. But if you break that down to different nationality groups or even religious denomination, like Muslims, you end up with 50, 60 cases. And that is, of course, a little bit problematic for statistical analysis. An additional thing that I'm doing on a fellowship of the Volkswagen Foundation since 2006 is that I'm also looking on the political representation on parliamentarians of immigrant background cross-nationally. There are data and analysis available for Germany, also longitudinally back to 1949 for the Bundestag, for the state parliaments, and back to 79 for the European elections held in Germany. And then for about a dozen of European countries, there is primarily cross-sectional data from around 2008 on parliamentarians of immigrant background. So I will present results first on participation, then on party choice, and then on representation. I will try to be quick on that. Electoral participation, there is no official data on electoral participation, unlike other countries, Scandinavia, Norway, Sweden, which have quite good data on that from the voting registers. We just don't know on the national level, not officially. The survey data, and you might be aware that if you ask respondents whether they intend to participate in an election, you always get over-reporting. But you can at least compare those numbers you get from the immigrant background population with the native population and see whether there is any significant difference. And it seems that there is a small participation gap that seems to have become a little bit bigger between the native and the naturalized voters on the national level, at least. If we look at the data from the cities, from the big cities, Hamburg, Bremen, Berlin, also Stuttgart provides some data. We see that especially EU citizens that are eligible to vote in local elections due to the Amsterdam Treaty show significantly lower rate of participation, which is about 1/3. From the participation level of the native German. So it's a significant difference. And if we try to find out what the reasons for that is, we have not come that far. But at least it seems that it might have something to do with cultural distance, maybe also with political socialization, since especially people from countries from Southern Europe participate much less than, for instance, people that come from the Western European countries or the northern countries. So then you can, always ask, does it have to do with this background, with this specific background, with the distance maybe to the political system, or might it have also to do with socialization, with being used to voting? An open question, not really satisfactorily answered yet. When we look at non-electoral participation, I've run several analyses with the in the study in Heidelberg, and I detected significant differences between the most recent big immigrant group that is often forgotten, which is the Russian-born ethnic Germans, and the Turkish-born German citizens, which are always in the focus of the media and of the debate, which is by far a much smaller group than the people that came from Russia. And the picture in the replication study of 2009, where I did the same thing, is a modified one. I will just show you some of these results. If we ask what they did in the past, and we had several items, 8 items. I'll just show you 8: to speak one's mind, to sign a petition, to participate in a strike. You got from the naturalized people in Heidelberg altogether a pretty high share for the first item, and also a quite high share of people that said nothing of these 8 options have been used in the past. And if you now look at the Turkish-born people there, you see that they actually participate more than the average naturalized citizens. So Turkish-born immigrants that have naturalized, at least for the Heidelberg case, and I also have some indication that this is also the case for the national level, that they actually participate to a high degree, and especially if you compare that to the Russian Germans that came significantly later. You see 45%, that's at the bottom of this graph, said that they have never used any of these 8 opportunities that have been offered to them to be used in the past. And now you see what changed in 2009. I will go back. So what changed is that the level of participation actually in 2009 got higher among those naturalized citizens, which has to do with the fact that most of them are there for a longer period of time now. But what is especially astonishing is that the Turkish-born population even participates to a higher degree than we have found in 1999. And on the other hand, that the participation gap, if we want to say so, of the Russian Germans got a little bit narrower in this respect. But still, the picture is not very different from 2009, at least if we look at the overall pattern. If we move on to party choice, we find distinctive voting patterns by national origin. Ethnic Germans, and especially those coming from Russia, have strongly supported the Christian Democrats in the past, up to 80% in publications that are available also in English that I've done. Turkish-born Germans and Muslims, and there comes a link to the Muslim population because it's very difficult to separate them. In all the surveys, you see an overlap of 80 to 90% of these very few cases. We have Muslims or Turkish-born immigrants. So the stronger indicator for voting behavior has always been the background, the country of background, not belonging to the Muslim denomination or to being a Muslim. So that's why in all of the analysis, the country of the background of immigrants has been used and has been more successfully been a predictor for the voting behavior. The 2009 data so far, and I only have these data for a couple of weeks now, so don't expect final results from me, but I've already looked into them, show a weakening of these patterns. So the SPD, and this is something that I actually predicted about 10 years ago, the SPD gains among those ethnic Germans from the former Soviet Union. In the pre-election survey of the German election study, they are even at the same level is the support for the Social Democrats compared to the Christian Democrats, which is a real surprise here that it goes so fast. Among the Turkish-born Germans and the Muslims, we see also losses, or we see losses of the party that has been supported most in the past, which is the SPD in this case, and we see especially gains of the socialists, but not, and this is an important information, no gains of the Christian Democrats from the Turkish-born or the Muslim voters. So all that has been, always discussed that, based on their conservative values and based on the change in policy positions of the Christian Democrats, they would be much more attractive to Muslim or Turkish-born voters. This does not hold in the empirical data that I have. When we come to explanations for these patterns, traditional explanations like socioeconomic status, candidates or issues are not as strong in explaining the immigrant vote than explaining the vote of the native. Religion is an explanatory factor, as I said, but because of this overlap, we see that the country of origin is a much better predictor. And this is another important information, I think, here, that we have to differentiate between the Turkish population or the Muslim population altogether and those who are naturalized, those who are eligible to vote. We have, on average, about the same educational levels, sometimes even a higher socioeconomic status among those naturalized Muslims and Turkish-born citizens in Germany. And that might be one case why most of them, at least in the surveys, don't say they are very much religious. So they are less religious than, for instance, the Russian-born German citizens. So that might be a reason for this factor not to be that important. The main explanation comes for these distinct voting patterns comes, in my view, from past and present policies of the parties, and that's why, political science is so important. To show you the pattern, or to start with some of those data, in the National Election Survey of 2009, and now I show you the pre and the post-election poll combined, we saw partisanship of all citizens, as you see it here. The Christian Democrats, which are the black, the black column. Is the strongest, and followed by the Social Democrats. And if you look at how this looks like, if someone has a Turkish mother, not much different. If you look at Turkish father, we have just 4% support for long-term support for the Christian Democrats, but an average or a majority supporting parties of the political left, with the Social Democrats still being in the lead. And what is also interesting here is to see that party identification is not overall lower. So we would expect immigrants or people that are not native to show lower degrees of partisanship. But here only 30% compared to 32% in the whole population say that they are not attached to a party. And here you see, if you exchange Turkish mother by Muslim, you get more or less the same picture. So this overlap comes through, and in this case, it would even be better to use religion. But in the past, this had not been the case. So I mentioned past and present policies as an important factor for supporting certain parties. And we asked those naturalized citizens in Heidelberg in 2009 which party was more favorable, or did the most favorable policies for you as an immigrant or as a formerly foreign citizen in the country. And what you see is that among those groups that are known to be the origin of ethnic Germans, like the former Soviet Union, the Romania, and Poland, they say that has been the CDU-CSU. They did the best policies for us. And if you look at the Turkish citizens here, none of the respondents in this survey said the Christian Democrats did the most favorable policy for them in the past, but they all more or less mention the Greens or the SPD. And we did the opposite thing. Which party policies were most or were least favorable for you as a group? And what is interesting here is that most of these Aussiedler, and that's the gray columns here, don't want to answer this question. They don't want to blame a certain party for having had bad policies for their group. But if you look at the Turkish bulk here, you see that at least 58% say it was the Christian Democrats which did an unfavorable policy for us as a group. Okay, so I don't have much time left, 0 minutes, I think. Descriptive representation, some results here. There has been a steady rise in the political representation of immigrants in parliaments. There have been just 5 in 1990 in the state, the Bundestag and the European Parliament, to currently 66 in those parliaments combined. Most of these MPs are in the SPD. Higher share is in among the Greens and the Socialists because they have fewer parliamentarians altogether. And we see a proportionate rise also in the CDU, CSU, and in the FDP. We find, however, more typical migrants on the political left. And I think I will skip substantive. Well, okay, just a few words on that. We see that immigrant MPs focus more on migration-related issues. They are also more often find in migration-related parliamentary committees. But very often these parliamentary-related activities match with very other activities they do. And what is also interesting that in a consecutive term, second or third term, the behavioral patterns do not change that much. So what we expected is that if someone is in parliament longer, he or she would actually concentrate less often on migration-related issues, which is not the case. Only if they move up, if they become a minister or if they take a position role, then this is more important. Okay, so just this line again, development. I will skip over that. And here you see data based on 2008, cross-sectional data, where those parliamentarians come from. And if you look at those parties of the political right, CDU, CSU, and FDP, you see there are many more from the West, and hardly anyone from Turkey. And if you look at the parties of the political left, you find that the big majority is of Turkish origin here. Yeah, open questions. More data necessary. I think that's something I always have to tell and say because that's important, for further research. The question is, does religious affiliation have an impact? I have already mentioned that. Other question is, are second and third generations different? No indication so far, especially when it comes to long-term party attachments and voting. You see the same patterns in the second and also partially in the third generation. How important are candidates of immigrant background for party choice? We find that in some cities candidates are supported across party lines, but we don't have data on the national level. And I mean, from a political science perspective, I think the most important issue is probably the interplay of parties and immigrant candidates or MPs. What qualifies or disqualifies a certain person to take to become a candidate or to get into a position role here. And the impact of immigrant MPs on legislation, something that has been mentioned before, is of course interesting. And I will try to answer some of these questions during the next 2 to 3 years. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you. At first, I'm very thankful to be here. Thank you for the invitation. Ladies and gentlemen, I'd like to give you an overview to the issue from a very local point of view as a member of the Cologne City Council. And if you allow, I'd like to start with a few little basic remarks about the preconditions local politicians have to deal with in Germany. In the late 70s, as we have heard, it was the former Prime Minister of the state of North Rhine-Westphalia, Heinz Kühn, who requested for the first time an immigration and integration policy for Germany. But the answer on the national level were programs for reunification of families and, if possible, to get immigrants back to their origin countries by paying money. So did the government of Helmut Schmidt. And my own parents belonged to the few that made use of it. They got back to Portugal, and I was forced to do so. But, as you can see, my personal integration in Portugal wasn't very successful. Later, in the 80s, under the government of Chancellor Helmut Kohl, the main goal of integration policies was to keep more immigrants out of Germany. The thesis was, Germany is not an immigration country, and there is no reason to begin a planned integration policy. But there was an increasing gap between this definition of not being an immigration country and the reality. It was finally Chancellor Schröder who recognized that it made no sense to continue defining or denying what was obvious. Germany is an immigration country since the 60s, and it was high time to start a planned integration policy. But when the government started by making the acquirement of German citizenship easier, it also became obvious that the German society at its total wasn't prepared, neither for dual citizenship nor for any other kind of integration policy that says Turkish immigrants also have the freedom of worship. They may build mosques. Bilingual education is good, and children within Turkish or Arab or any other background should be given the possibility to learn their language of origin. On the national level, it was finally Chancellor Angela Merkel who established a structured dialogue with the Muslim community. But this is just one part of the answer given to Heinz Kühn's request I mentioned at the beginning. The other part was given by the local administrations and local councils. In 1979, the Cologne City's Council was the first in Germany to approve a so-called program for the integration of foreigners and their families. Later on, the name was changed into Program for the Integration of Immigrants. The main aims were, generally speaking, the economic, social, and cultural integration of immigrants. For that purpose, the administration helped the immigrants to found their own social and cultural clubs. Language courses were promoted, pupils got help doing their homework to achieve better and higher educational levels. This program was very helpful to build a kind of social infrastructure for the integration of immigrants, but it didn't and it couldn't fill the lack of political rights and equality. But as we heard before, and it's my opinion too, this last point is the most, or at least one of the most important ones in this issue. The absence of immigrant participation in elections, or neither on local or national level, is an absence of the electoral right to do so, and especially for the older immigrants. Those who naturalized or acquired a German citizenship participate in elections quite as Germans do, so far as I know. But as a great part of all Germans, they're disillusioned by politics. They don't believe that democratic processes can change anything. This certainly has to do with their personal life experience. Although immigrants work, pay taxes, have achieved high education levels or good vocational trainings, they are more often affected by unemployment. When a mosque is to be built, Muslims are confronted with a hostile public opinion and low political support. This has to do with the still missing political rights for most of the Muslims, or in the case of Germany, the people with a Turkish background. It's easy for German politicians to make an immigration and integration policy not for the whole society, but just for the German voters. Let me give you an example. In Cologne, as in some other cities of North Rhine-Westphalia, we are confronted by right-wing extremism. The so-called pro-Köln movement or party is using the fact to promote anti-Islamic campaigning, putting Islam and Muslims as extreme Islamists and potential terrorists. Although pro-Köln is represented in the city council, it has no real political influence. But, and this might be much more dangerous, it has influence on the political climate. although all the democratic parties represented in the Cologne City Council agreed with the fact that Muslims also have the freedom of worship and that there were no reasons to reject the plans of DITIB to build a mosque, there was no bright approval of it in the council. The conservative CDU, after a long debate, abstained. They seemed to fear that approval could mean to lose traditional voters. Nevertheless, there is a consensus about combating pro-Köln in a democratic and political discourse. But getting back to the question of political rights. Early in the 90s, the state of Schleswig-Holstein tried to give foreigners the local election right, as many other European countries did since the 1960s. The German Constitutional Court stopped that law and said that for the purpose the constitution had to be reformed. Unfortunately, the needed two-thirds majority in the Bundestag is missing until today. But meanwhile, the citizens of the European Union got that local election right, just as Andreas Wüst said. Just the largest group of immigrants, the Turks, is still rightless, so far as they don't naturalize. So all these experiences don't motivate people to get engaged for social and political issues in Germany. And that's, I think, that is the reason why only few immigrants are organized in political parties. Most of them, when they are engaged in social and political issues, they concentrate on immigration organizations. On the other hand, especially younger people require this German citizenship, so the number of potential voters is increasing. That's the reason why the traditional German parties try to get candidates to run for a seat in the local councils or a state parliament. But compared with the immigration population, they're just a kind of a symbol of a new time. The political parties are still unprepared for the fully political integration. They don't want to lose potential voters on the one hand, but they're not making enough efforts to win them on the other. Of course, the Muslim communities see themselves underrepresented. That's the reason why some of them tried to build up an own party. At the local elections in the state of North Rhine-Westphalia in last August, a group named BIG, Bürger in Gelsenkirchen, or citizens of Gelsenkirchen, run for mandates in the city council of that city. A similar group appeared in the former German capital of Bonn. In both cities, they were successful. The traditional parties had no immigrant candidates running for the local councils. But in cities like Cologne, Düsseldorf, or a few others, there was no apparent reason for Turkish Muslims or Turkish people to run on their own, because the parties had immigrant candidates. At the Cologne Council, there now are 4 councillors with an immigration background, 3 of them with a Turkish background. 3 are members of the SPD and 1 of the party The Left, Die Linke, that's what Andreas Wüst called socialists. Yeah, I define it in another way. Efkan Kara, a member of the CDU, also ran for the council, but wasn't successful. He's now trying to obtain a seat in the state's parliament, but I'm afraid he has a little possibility. But what is... we can discuss that afterwards. We'll see next Sunday. But what is important, and I should add that none of these persons see themselves as Muslim representatives, but more likely migrant representatives. And in defense of Efkan Kara, I think he is just one example how traditional parties like to use candidates with immigration backgrounds. Catching votes, but if possible, not catching seat, or better, not catching seats instead of German candidates. Nevertheless, I think we are at the beginning of a new era in the integration policies. The traditional German parties know that they won't be successful in the future if they don't convince the immigrants that they too have good prospects in being part of this political system. In spite of all these facts, immigrants have had the possibility to make sure that they are heard by local politicians. In the middle of the 90s, the North Rhine-Westphalian law on local affairs forced the cities with more than 5,000 foreign inhabitants to found so-called integration councils. At the beginning, they were thought to be some kind of a surrogate for the missing local election rights. Although the voting rates are very low and these councils have little political influence, most of the councils became a kind of a political lobby organization with elected representatives of the immigrant population. In the last few years, they obtained an increasing influence on local integration policies, and as for example, the Cologne Integration Council was successful in establishing bilingual primary schools. The admission of languages as Turkish, Italian or others as normal subject at schools are another goal of the Integration Council, and we have been successful. The Integration Council also organized a strong political support for the building of the Cologne Mosque. Meanwhile, their political work is recognized as an important part of local affairs. In a certain way, this means Muslim interests are successfully represented if they are the interest of all migrant groups. And let me make a last remark. Currently, there are around 100 members of local councils in all North Rhine-Westphalia with an immigration background. 100 of 10,000. But the number is increasing. There were just 55 elected immigrants in 2004, and the number nearly doubled in 2009. And I'm quite sure it will significantly increase in the elections, in the local elections of 2014. Thank you.
Thank you very much. All right, we have heard a great deal about both the local and the national levels. I'm sure you have questions. As before, will you please identify yourself when you speak and wait for the microphone? Questions?
Hi, this is Jenny Leitz again. My question is, it sounds like in Germany, the people who naturalize do participate in the political process. My question is the naturalization process extremely difficult or cumbersome? I'm not even sure what it is in the United States, much less in Germany, so I'm curious whether that is actually one of the impediments.
I think I need a translator to answer that question. Is it possible?
Translator here?
Maybe I start and then you add to that.
Well, even so, if you just bear with me for a moment, Andreas, is there somebody who can come up and translate? Or
I mean, we can also try it here. Yeah.
okay, if you could do that, that would be great. Thank
I'll
you.
try in English. Start.
We'll do it.
Ja, bitte.
Yeah. So compared to other countries, naturalization in Germany used to be almost the toughest in the world, only to be compared with Switzerland, which is a little bit more difficult. There have been changes in the naturalization requirements starting in 1990, then 93, and then we have the big law change in 99, which lowered the number of years, and you now have a right for naturalization based on if you fulfill a certain a mix of criteria. But the biggest problem that added to the new naturalization law is language capabilities. So you have to prove that you can speak German, German well. And you also have to do an integration test in most of the Bundesländer, which is now being harmonized. So it is easier than it used to be, but I would not say it's easy compared to other countries.
One addition, I'll try to give you the answer in English. Children born in Germany from parents with migrant background achieve automatically the German naturalization, the German citizenship. But when they're 18 or let's say adults, they have to choose whether they want to be Turkish or Portuguese or whatever, or Germans. And I think that's one of the main problems, because young people don't feel like Germans or don't feel like Turks. They feel like both, and they'd like to be both.
Maybe just on that, this will be something that will come up in the next 5 to 10 years, because that law was effective, the introduction of a jus soli component in 2000. So once they become adults, which will start in 2018, we will see these problems. And then I think it's a very strange element of the new law that has been forced to be included by the FDP, by the Liberal Party in Germany. Liberal is not liberal in the American sense, but kind of neoconservative, I would say, in some respects, but also a libertarian party to some extent. And they force that we have this option that people with duals who have received two citizenships have to decide until the age of 23. I think that's really a big problem in this law, and I really hope that this will be changed within the next 8 years or so.
Maybe you could explain the difference.
Can you take the microphone, okay?
Yeah.
Thanks.
If you could explain that until 93, when was it?
23.
20, yeah, that Germany was a jus sanguinis, and they had jus sanguinis and not jus soli, and had the difference between that.
I mean, every country has jus sanguinis, also the US. Every country has jus sanguinis elements, but Germany was among the few countries who only had jus sanguinis elements. So you could only become a German if your father or mother had been a German. And the jus soli component for those children born on German soil of at least one parent that has permanent residency, and there's a couple of other criteria, but then not that important, qualifies for German citizenship and gets German citizenship. But if he or she gets another citizenship as well, for instance, Turkish and German, he or she has to decide by the age of 23, the latest. And that, poses a lot of pressure and problems on them.
Thank you. The gentleman here?
Germany, Mike Kürzing, if you're born in Germany from Turkish parents, or even if one of them is Turkish parents, does the Turkish government recognize them as Turkish citizens, or as German citizens, or are they in dual citizenship? If you're born in Germany from Turkish parents, the Turkish government recognizes you as a Turkish citizen or as a Turk.
I'm not completely sure about that. Maybe you're sure about that.
Ja, ich glaube, diesmal muss ich doch auf Deutsch antworten. Wenn ein Kind mit türkischen Eltern oder auch nur einem türkischen Elternteil geboren wird, hat es, sofern die Eltern das wollen, auch immer das Recht, die türkische Staatsbürgerschaft zu erlangen. Das Problem taucht jetzt auf, weil mit Inkrafttreten des neuen Staatsbürgerschaftsrechts 1999, glaube ich, haben Kinder, die bis zu dem Zeitpunkt 10 Jahre alt waren, die Möglichkeit bekommen, die deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft zu erhalten, ohne dass die Eltern die deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft gebraucht hätten. Und diese sind nun 18 oder vielleicht auch etwas älter, sodass das Problem jetzt auftaucht und in den nächsten Jahren sicher nochmal verstärkt sein wird. Die müssen sich jetzt entscheiden, aber ihre persönlichen Erfahrungen, so wie ich versucht habe, das darzustellen, mit der deutschen Mehrheitsbevölkerung und auch gewisse politische und soziale Erfahrungen, lassen viele davor zurückscheuen, auf eine der beiden Staatsbürgerschaften verzichten zu wollen. Sie fühlen sich auch ein Stück unwohl, um es mal ganz vorsichtig auszudrücken, ihren Familien gegenüber, wenn sie sozusagen sich für die deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft entscheiden. Das kommt oder kann zumindest so ankommen, wie ich negiere sozusagen meinen türkischen Hintergrund. Und das hat aber nicht allein was mit Türkei oder gar muslimischer Welt zu tun. Ich kann Ihnen sagen, dass selbst Portugiesen sich äußerst schwer damit tun, die deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft zu erlangen oder zu beantragen, obwohl sie teilweise genauso lange, 30, 40 Jahre im Land leben. Und meine Eltern, die ja nun zurückgegangen sind, die haben sich in der Tat etwas angegriffen gefühlt, in Anführungszeichen, als ich ihnen erzählt habe, ich habe die deutsche Staatsbürgerschaft angenommen.
Okay, if a child is born to Turkish parents, or even just one Turkish parent in Germany, they have the right to the German citizenship? Die deutsche
Turkish.
Okay, the right to both citizenships, the Turkish and the German. And the problem is now coming into the spotlight, so to say, because this new citizenship law was enacted in 1999, and children that were at that point 10 years old were allowed to get the German citizenship, even though their parents might not have gotten the German citizenship. And now these kids are 18 years or older, and they have to decide which citizenship they want to retain. And their personal experience with the German majority population and sort of the societal and political experience kind of leads them to have this dilemma, and they don't want to renounce either citizenship. Also because in terms of their family background, they feel that if they renounce their origin citizenship and retain the German citizenship, then they also sort of reject their parents, or they reject their family. And this isn't, specific to the Turkish or the Muslim background. Also, in this case, like the Portuguese families, for example, Portuguese immigrants have a hard time deciding. And when I picked the German citizenship, my parents who went back to Portugal felt a bit of a betrayal or a reaction of their way of life.
Thank you. Yes, there's a question in the back, please.
Hi, I'm Juliette Tolai from the Transatlantic Academy. I actually would like to answer, I'm doing a lot of studies on Turkey, so I would like to answer kind of the Turkish side on this. If you are born from a Turkish or a Turkish father or mother, wherever you live, you have access to Turkish citizenship. And Turkey accepts double citizenship. So if you are, it's actually my case. I'm a French citizen originally, but I now have access to Turkish citizenship, and I can have both. Interestingly, in the case of Germany, because it is the only country that doesn't accept this double citizenship, the Turkish government has developed this very interesting policy for Turkish citizens who denied their Turkish citizenship and accepted the German citizenship. They issued what they call a pink document, kind of a pink ID, which basically gives these German citizens, who used to be Turkish citizens, the same rights as Turkish citizens, except for the voting rights. So there is this very, very interesting kind of around-the-clock thing, which kind of allows some of the Germans of Turkish origin to kind of still feel connected with Turkey. Yes, this is German requirements.
All right, more other questions? Sonia?
Thank you. There seems to be a tension between we can't use the word assimilating anymore, integrating, or sort of, it seems like the less distinctively Muslim you are, the more likely you are to be elected. So, I think Abdelkader suggested that ultimately for Muslims to gain political office, the ultimate benefit is more symbolic than anything else. Would you agree that there has to be a kind of, not sanitizing, that's not the right word, but just sort of a de-Islamicization, or in other words, what do Muslim candidates bring to the table that's different from other candidates? And to the extent that they do embrace specifically or distinctively Muslim values or positions or whatever, does that jeopardize their candidacies? So in the end, what is gained by Muslims gaining political office? Is that a tension, and how does that sort of sort itself out?
Yes, there are two questions here, and they're related, right? The first one is, my answer is yes. The more there are Islamic markers for a candidate, the less likely they are to be elected in the United States. Now, in my micro study of the Detroit area, for example, there was one exception, and he's a mayor of Wayne, city of Wayne. His name is Abdul, and in a city where you hardly have any Muslims or Arabs, city of Wayne, but he served for 30 years as a volunteer and was very active to the point where his Muslim identity didn't matter anymore. It's also a highly educated area, which is very liberal, etc. Now, but among all others who ran for political office locally and on the county level, etc., if you had a clearly Muslim name, you were way less likely to get elected, unless you came from Hamtramck, again, where you have almost a Muslim majority. Now, those who do get elected have camouflaged names, like Suzanne Sereni in Dearborn. She's Muslim Shia Lebanese, but many people did not know that. They thought she was Italian, even in the council, among the staffers, etc. And so yes, it helps. And to have another identity, if you're black and Muslim, it makes you more acceptable. I mean, there's a tradition of having black Muslims. There's Malcolm X. There's all that. As long as you're not too much like Nation of Islam, Farah Khan, etc. And so now there are strategies to deal with this. When Andre Carson, the second congressman to be, was running for office, Keith Ellison gave him a lot of advice, the first Muslim, about how to deal with his Muslim identity. Everybody knows, the information is out there, is available that they both are Muslim. And so they had to preempt attacks by giving their own narratives. And so they gave interviews about what it means to them to be a Muslim. They don't wear it on their sleeve, but said, yes, I am a Muslim. I'm proud of it. That's what Islam does to me. It gives me a set of ethics to behave, in public office. But I serve everybody. I'm not a Muslim representative. I'm the representative of my district. And by putting it in those terms, they preempted any attacks that allude that they're hiding who they are or that they're a Manchurian candidate of the sort. And they've done that effectively and helped them. Now, Keith Ellison was attacked left and right, even after he was elected in Congress by fellow congressmen, Virgil Goody, who was really on the extreme right of the Republican Party even. But Andre Carson was not attacked because he did that very, very successfully.
I'd like to add something, because I think implicit, as I've been listening to the two panels, I started asking myself, the title of this is Muslim Integration and Mobilization. I started thinking, some of us are answering the question differently. So by integration, do we mean to what extent do Muslims participate in the system versus to what extent do Muslims participate as Muslims in the system? And here's why I say this. I think it's really comparable to women in politics. So if we make this more comparative, the question is, I don't think diversity hurts Muslims, just like diversity doesn't hurt women in politics. It just doesn't help them, because women are voting because they're, rich or poor. So the key question, I think, is how do we define success in that model? Is it successful that Muslims are actually in the political system, or do we expect them to do something for someone else? So everything you just said could be applied to Hillary Clinton.
Right.
And that was the part of my talk I didn't get to.
Would you say the same is true for Germany?
Well, and some reflections on that. I think, you have mentioned what is discussed as surrogate representation in representation theory, so that actually representatives, once they are elected, recognize that they are of immigrant background, that they are Muslims, because they are contacted by people of the same background or the same group. And that actually helps the groups, I think, because there is a link established. Those politicians are aware of the issues that are in the constituency, in other constituencies, in this group. So I think there is a positive, a substantive effect that has not been, quantitatively been proven yet. But I think there is something. At least that's what I'm also taking out of the personal interviews I've done with some German MPs. And then there's the other thing is candidacy or a position role, so being important for the party or in parliament. And I have the same, as you found in the US, I have the same results for Germany. It's good if you have an immigrant background and if you are a woman. So you fulfill 2 quotas, especially in the Green Party, but also in the big Volksparteien. That helps you. It's worse to be a man, and to get into a position role. It is always good if you are visible, if you are easily detected to be a Muslim or someone with a different background. But if you don't do anything on these issues, if you just do your work, may it be in a certain policy area detached from migration. So that's the 2 things I want to say.
Do you want to add anything, Susanna?
Just one remark. The MP Lale Akgün, she was a member of the Bundestag for 7 years, I think.
Mm-hmm.
She had an image of herself, or has an image of herself, not being a politician because she has a Turkish background, but she defines herself as a politician in Germany, and she looks much more to the German voters than to the voters with Turkish background. And maybe that's one of the reasons why the SPD is losing voters in the community of the Turkish Germans.
Can I make a last remark on this, please? Okay, there's a big problem here. I didn't talk about the quality of representation. Now, in list systems, where basically the party leaders choose who is on the list, in Europe they often pick Muslims who are like they want Muslims to become, as opposed to who Muslims are. And so you end up having a lot of beautiful women in their 20s, Muslim, very liberal, on the party lists, from Belgium to the Netherlands. I mean, I have nothing against having young, beautiful 20-year-old women, to be represented, but I mean, it doesn't represent the entire Muslim community in the country. It's very, so many feel left out, precisely. And the parties have a lot of control over what their parliamentarians do in those systems, because they will control the list in the next election. So they have very little leeway to behave independently, as opposed to, say, this in the UK, where many of the MPs are more active, and there is a very complicated role of power between the party and the MP. And the more secure the MP becomes over time, the more assertive they become in the UK, in the US, or in Canada.
We haven't spoken about the role of money in political elections, and you can talk about the German situation, but certainly money is incredibly important in the American system. So I'm just wondering, with the memory of people like Hillary Clinton when she was running for the Senate, returning money that was supposedly tainted because it came from a Muslim or an Arab source, can you comment at all on the ability of candidates to raise money, candidates who are Muslims raising money, and could you at the same time pick up on something that we haven't really explored here, although Janan, you alluded to it in your early remarks, the fact that when Muslim immigrants started arriving in the United States in very large numbers starting in the 1980s, they were coming into a country that already had a Muslim population. And what difference does this make? What is the import of the first 2 Muslim congressmen being African American? Could either of you comment on those?
Okay. Well, so I think on the money issue, I think was alluded to in the first panel with the CARE trying to get the philanthropists, Islamic philanthropists. They have. I know this because I'm part of the Duke Islamic Studies Center, and of course, on the development side, the deepest pockets are from people who have international ties. It is hard to get them to give money for various reasons, especially to the American political system. So I'm talking about these are people who are abroad. So the transnational link, where the real money is it is very hard to tap into that. They are very wary of giving money to the American system, and they do it in very specific ways. So the political system is one area, based on my knowledge, that they avoid contributing to. I mean,
not supposed to.
Right. But I mean, but there's a tension. They want to influence U.S. foreign policy. So
Yes. The thing is, in the United States, there's a large American Muslim middle class and doctors and what have you, and lawyers and what have you, and you know, they have resources. And when I did an analysis of the donations to Keith Ellison, I mean, many of them were substantial, 1,000, 1,500 from professionals, etc. Now, with Andre Carson, he also had received substantial support when he ran. And you have, by the way, several PACs, Muslim PACs that have formed the last few years. Some of them are more ephemeral than others, but they do muster enough resources to support candidates they're excited about. You know, and of course, a Muslim candidate can never win just on the Muslim money or Muslim vote or what have you. Right. You know, and I mean, Keith Ellison has wide base of support. He's very popular in his district. I mean, he represents it quite well, quite effectively. You know, and so this has to be basically the money and the votes that come from Muslims have to just make up for any penalty that they would suffer, you know. Now, and they may actually lose it. I mean, Andre Carson did some things that have cost him a lot of support in the Muslim community when the Gaza war took place, and he actually supported legislation in Congress that was perceived by Muslims in the country to be much more pro-Israel than it is defends the rights of the Palestinians. You know, and so he may actually lose that, and he will have to rely even more. But they're also part of an apparatus, of the party apparatus, a democratic one, etc., that also provides a conduit for a lot of funding for them.
So this exactly gets to the point about what do we mean by integration. So if you have a Muslim that then I'm trying to think of a politically correct way to say this, ticks off his constituency. Does that mean fewer Muslims are integrated into the American political system, or you know what I'm... So, I mean, just having a figurehead in politics doesn't necessarily make an integrated community.
Yes. But there's also other processes taking place in a parallel way, but those symbolic triumphs, say, or having representation, somebody just like you know, in an elected body is important. But for example, staffers on Capitol Hill, they augmented from 15 5 years ago to about 100 Muslim staffers out of about 10,000 on Capitol Hill. Now, as many people here know, the staffers are people who are involved, politically motivated, and they are the pool from which future elected officials will, you know, may come from, you know, and so it's happening. There's a process going on, and this is the most visible tip of the iceberg.
And I just want to say one last thing and reopen up questions. We have to keep in mind the Muslim population relative to the U.S. population is small. I had lunch with Phil Bennett yesterday, who used to be the acting editor of the Washington Post, who's now at Duke. And he said, when I was there, we wanted more Muslim journalists. He's like, but, you know, it's not like there's a Muslim on every street corner. He's like, we needed more. We needed to feed them into journalism schools. He said, but it's just not like that they're, you know, everywhere. So, I mean, I think, you know, that's part of it as well. When we talk about them, what is their proportionate size relative to other large groups in the U.S.?
Yeah. Oh, I'm sorry.
Just one sentence on the system difference. An average candidate for the Bundestag spends about 10,000 euros. I think you can probably not even become a sheriff in somewhere deep in the far west with just spending 10,000 euros. And the maximum spending, that at least what we found out in the German candidate study 2005, was 200,000 euros by a CDU constituency candidate, but that's it. So that would not be possible to enter any national race in the U.S. No, there is no limit, but there is also a high share of party funds. You know, the smaller the party, normally the higher the share of party funds, and also the leftist parties, they give more money to their candidates than the center-right parties.
Other questions?
I didn't know that.
There's the gentleman over here. I think we're going to, at this point, start accumulating. But the gentleman over here, and then the gentleman in the back, and.
Joseph Gordon. I'm intrigued by the Turkish voting pattern for the SPD and for the Greens. Could that be perhaps attributed to the Turkish origin? Very secular, 80% are not religious, they're very secular. And also, this may impinge on our foreign policy discussion, but Turkish public opinion, at least today, is very anti-U.S., anti-Israel, and perhaps they would relate to these parties, perhaps being more sympathetic to those kinds of interests.
Andreas, let's get the other question before either of you respond to that, okay?
The question that has kept me... Some people have touched on this question, but it's an important question. I thought that Susana dos Santos brought it up. Has there been any study done in Germany? And it's about, I'm more interested in the quality of representation, the content of representation here than the symbolics of representation, especially for groups struggling to become integrated, to become part of society. You said that there were some Turks running on, who had organized themselves to run in certain part of Germans as kind of more or less a immigrant Turkish parties groups, right? Has there been any study done between, for example, the program that they are presenting and the program that, for example, integrated Turks within the SPD or CDU or Green Party are representing? Because obviously these who are incorporated within these parties have tremendous type of negotiations, ongoing negotiations of how far they're going to go against discrimination, against racism, against Islamophobia, against marginalization. Has there been any type of thing? And has some of the guys who, or ladies who were involved in these parties, be it the SPD on local, in any level, I don't really care, have they been forced at a certain moment, like sometimes happens in the United States, right, that you reach a point that you say, look, I cannot agree to the compromises anymore, even if it means at the end of my career, I will step out and speak out for what I stand for and for what my community stands for.
One more question to put into the mix. Final question, Sonia.
In the last few years, really since John F. Kennedy, I think, but certainly increasingly, candidates' religion, politicians' religion has become much more salient. I think it was much more sub rosa previously. To what extent do you think that helps Muslim candidates, or does it inhibit them? And is the same thing true in Germany, that the religion of a candidate is a well-known fact?
Let's begin with the answers about Germany, if we may.
I think I answer to the gentleman, but if you allow, in German. Zunächst einmal, die Besonderheit in Gelsenkirchen und Bonn im letzten Jahr war wirklich, dass die traditionellen Parteien, ich denke, man kann sagen, es versäumt haben, Menschen mit Migrationshintergrund aufzustellen, obwohl zumindest die Communities das eigentlich erwarten. Nicht so sehr, weil die Menschen ihre Präferenzen bei der Wahl abhängig machen davon, ob Migranten aufgestellt werden oder nicht, sondern sie sehen das als den Willen, Menschen zu integrieren an. Und das ist sozusagen für sie eine Art Barometer, ob das wirklich ernst gemeint ist. Ich glaube, in Gelsenkirchen war die Gruppe Bürger in Gelsenkirchen deswegen auch prompt, glaube ich, mit Fraktionsstatus, also 3 Mitgliedern im Stadtrat, erfolgreich, weil sie besonders enttäuscht waren darüber, dass es insbesondere der SPD nicht gelungen ist, geeignete Kandidaten zu finden oder vielleicht auch nicht hat finden wollen. Und in Bonn kenne ich die Umstände nicht so genau, aber sie werden ähnlich sein. Das Interessante ist, dass sich daraus jetzt etwas entwickelt. Es ist der Versuch, jetzt über diese lokalen Gruppen hinaus, diese Partei, wenn Sie so wollen, oder diese Bewegung auf Landesebene zu etablieren. In einigen Städten gibt es auch Direktkandidaten für den Landtag in Nordrhein-Westfalen. Die haben in der Regel einen türkischen Migrationshintergrund, in der Regel, es gibt auch einige Ausnahmen. Und sie sind längst nicht überall. Aber ich habe den Eindruck, sie haben den festen Willen, sich zu etablieren. Und zumindest auf kommunaler Ebene, wo es keine 5%-Hürde gibt bei den Wahlen, haben sie gute Chancen, sich weiter zu etablieren. Und was die Frage betrifft, inwieweit es Studien darüber gibt, wie das Wahlverhalten ist, ich kann es im Grunde nur aus persönlicher Beobachtung sagen. Mir sind keine solche Studien bekannt.
Okay, first of all, the specifics in Gelsenkirchen and Bonn, the traditional parties have neglected to get party candidates with a migrant background, and but people expect them to do so, especially because they see it as a sign that the parties want to integrate people with a migration background. And if the parties fail to do so, that it is looked upon as a lack of this desire. In the terms of Gelsenkirchen, the group Citizens for Gelsenkirchen were successful in putting 3 of their members in the city council, because they were especially disappointed, there was a special disappointment that the SPD in particular didn't find the right candidates and didn't seem to want to find the right candidates. And although I don't know exactly the circumstances in Bonn, this seems to be a similar case. But what especially interesting is what comes next. Now these groups are attempting to establish themselves on the state level. And while there are some exceptions to that, there seems to be a very strong desire, also, especially if not on the state level, because there's a 5% barrier for state parliaments, but especially on the communal level to get more support. And in terms on studying on the voting behavior, I only know this from sort of a personal anecdotal level, and I'm not aware of any studies that have been done in that regard.
Andreas, you want to add anything?
Your question was directed for on this success in the local city councils. I don't know of any scientific studies or academic studies either. Two other points here. One was Sonja's question on religious background of the candidates. It does not play any role at all, I would say, in Germany. So the whole question of values and of religious background that is very strong in the United States is not taking place in Germany either. Even the opposite is taking place. I think we are more and more becoming more secularized than we have been before. Support for the SPD and the Greens. I mean, I've mentioned policies in the past, and maybe I have not made strong enough that it might also have something to do with being an authentic party. Especially when you compare that to to Özkan being appointed as a minister of the CDU, what we have discussed in the other panel, that is not authentic. I mean, that is really a symbolic policy on those voters. But the voters are not stupid. I mean, they detect and they know which are the parties that are doing, they are tackling their issues, that are bringing forward politicians or candidates of their group, and also produce a certain policy output. And of course, the German system is insofar also an exception, since we don't have a real conservative party that is non-Christian. Or not explicit non-Christian. If we had such a conservative party, I think the picture would be slightly different. But I don't know. It's a hypothetical thing.
And do you want to say anything?
Was your question also to the U.S. case?
Oh, absolutely.
Okay. Well, so I think Abdelkader laid out very nicely the conditions under which a Muslim could get elected. I think it absolutely hurts them, and I absolutely think that look, Barack Obama, as black as he was, avoided that entirely, because in the U.S., anything that's seen as outside of American, whatever American is going to hurt you. And there were the studies that came out that showed that Americans think that Muslims are second only to atheists as the group who doesn't share their views. So being a Muslim is about as far away from being an American in Americans' eyes as possible. So, I mean, is it salient to the candidate? Potentially, but I think, they're treading fine waters if they're using it to try to get voted into any office.
I just add a little bit of color on this. The Gallup surveys and the Pew surveys basically show that most sources of the discrimination against candidates of some minority background are in the single digits or low teens if they are Christian or from a Judeo-Christian background. But being a woman is now in the single digits. Being against Jews is the low teens. When it comes, there are 3 groups that stand out: Mormons, worse than them, Muslims, and worse than both atheists, like Jonathan said.
And homosexuals as well.
Okay.
But Muslims were at the top of the list.
And so if your candidate is one of those backgrounds, highly disadvantaged. Also, if you look at the distribution of religious groups as represented in Congress, compared to how represented they are in the population is very consistent. So basically, it's almost as if you drew them by chance from the population, so long as they are of some Christian group, except for including Mormons, and that's because they are areas of Mormon concentration where Mormons are very likely to get elected, and that makes up for how they're perceived in the other areas from Utah and neighboring states. But if you are of Muslims, Hindus, and Buddhists are heavily underrepresented, even though that's beginning to change. I think we now have 1 or 2 Buddhists in Congress, and of course the 2 Muslims.
Okay.
I will say one last thing. Duke hired one of the first imams. I think there's 1 or 2 other universities that has a full-time imam, Abdullah Antepli, and he was invited up to Congress to say the opening prayer just recently, like a month ago. So, I mean, there is some, I'm going to do like the previous panel and try to end on a positive note.
Yeah, particularly after that follows Keith Ellison's being attacked because he wanted to be sworn in on a Quran rather than in the Bible. So maybe there's some progress. Maybe there's some hope. Well, a lot of food for thought here. We also need food for the body, however. And so we're going to break for lunch, which will be buffet style outside. Please feel free to bring your lunch back in here while you continue conversations. Or if you prefer, there are couches down on the 4th floor. You're welcome to take your lunch down there and have it there. But we're going to reconvene here promptly at 2:30. So before you break, will you please join me in thanking our panel?